Every day is a Saturday. That's one of those great retirement sayings. What it means is you get to do what you want, when you want. After 30 years of being told where to be, when to be, and how to be, it's very liberating. My wife was at work and I had finished all of the little chores I wanted to get done around the house. I sat down and fired up the streaming services. I was looking for a little movie I could put on and probably take a nap. My search stopped on The Fastest Woman on Earth. That put a twist in my afternoon plans. The Fastest Woman on Earth is a 2022 documentary about Jessie Combs, her quest to break the women's land speed record, and her ultimate death. I was familiar with Jessie Combs. I'd watched her in a number of television shows over the years, especially Overhaulin and Mythbusters. I also enjoy documentaries, so clicking play was a no-brainer. I started crying about 5 minutes into the film and couldn't stop crying the rest of the afternoon. As cops, we get very good at compartmentalizing trauma. When we deal with all of those horrible things day in and day out, we put them behind a door, lock it tight, and throw away the key. Something in that movie opened one of those doors for me and let it all out. It was a rough afternoon, but it would have been rougher if I didn't understand what was going on with me. It's time to start telling our own stories. I'm Steve Kellums, and welcome to Blue Canary. Mental health for law enforcement is an issue that we still fight today. Even though we should know better, we still stigmatize getting help. We still want to portray ourselves and our profession as stoic, strong, and above those emotions. We are not. I wanted to talk to an officer who had experienced dealing with mental health issues, someone who understood the problem and was willing to deal with it head on. That's when I connected with Zachary Saenz. Zachary has over 8 years in law enforcement and has served as a patrol officer, field training officer, and now as a patrol sergeant. He is an advocate for mental health in law enforcement, a peer counselor, and his story is an important one to hear. Zach, thanks so much for coming on and talking with me today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, Steve.
So really, before we get started, can you talk a little bit about how you got into law enforcement, how you became a cop, and then how you got involved into the mental health side for police?
So I never wanted to be a cop. It kind of just happened. But back in 2015, I was working at the sheriff's office as a quartermaster, or as an admin assistant. And then later on in the year, I became the quartermaster. And I applied for the Sheriff's Department Academy. While I was going through that process, our local PD was also hiring. So I went through their process and I ended up getting hired with the PD. So in 2017, that's when I started. And yeah, so it wasn't planned. It just pretty much happened. I was around law enforcement. My dad was a military police officer. My brother is a customs agent. So pretty much that's how other reasons why I joined.
So you kind of felt like you got hooked, huh?
Yep. Yeah. I would hear the stories and hear, some of the fun and some of the tragedy, but it sounded like, helping people that were going through bad times caught my attention. So I really just wanted to help people out.
Now you went on through college, working on degrees in psychology as well as mental health issues. How did you bring that into law enforcement? You talk about destigmatizing it. How is that something that you got involved in, and why is that important to you?
So I got into the whole mental health aspect of in law enforcement. It kind of started before I became a cop. My dad is an Operation Iraqi Freedom veteran, and I saw how he struggled with PTSD and depression and anxiety. So when I became a cop, after responding to several traumatic calls, the first one being a suicide in 2018, I was on my third phase of FTO, and a guy had shot himself in the head in front of his girlfriend. So I went in. I literally told myself, "Hey, pretend it's a video game, and it's gonna be over when you're, done." So we go in, we clear, make sure the scene is clear, and the guy still had the gun in his hand, but he was already deceased. After we finished the call, my FTO asked me, "Hey, do you want to go back to PD and debrief, or do you want to, just you want to calm down?" And I was like, "No, being a rookie cop, I was like, nah, I'm good. I don't want to show weakness." So then, 2 weeks after that, I started having nightmares about the scene, and it was the original scene, and then the nightmares would change to, okay, now this guy is asking me for help and gargling in his own blood. And then the next nightmare would be, oh, now he already shot himself, but now he's pointing the gun at me, and now I have to shoot him. So once I started experiencing all that, I kind of, try to keep pushing it down. And then uh, I finally realized that I was messed up in 2021 when my grandmother passed away. She passed away from Alzheimer's, and she was on hospice at my aunt's house. And so we went over there, and since she was on hospice, we don't have to call a JP for a time of death. So the nurse was able to call it. Funeral home got there, and I put my grandma in the funeral home van, just like I was at any other death call at work. No tears, no emotion, just putting her in there. And that's when I knew I was, excuse my French, fucked up. Um, I look at my dad, he's not crying. I like touch my face to see if I have tears, and there's nothing, and I felt guilty for that. And that's when I felt like I should have gotten help, but I didn't know how to get it. And then in 2022, I was involved in a officer involved shooting, and that was pretty much the cherry on top for all my trauma. And I started going to therapy, but even with the therapy, I was still having suicidal ideations. And in 2023, I got super intoxicated at a wedding, and while my fiance was driving us home, I wanted to jump out of the vehicle. And so I called my supervisor, and one of our patrolmen showed up at my house. And later on, the I believe I was still on admin leave at this time. Actually, no, I was not on admin leave. I was on light duty, and and I kind of felt like, hey, you know what? I'm not the only one. I'm probably not the only one, but at the same time, in my department, I felt like I was the only one that was going through this. I was the only weak one, and so I uh, I went through several different psychological evaluations. I believe it was six, and you know, I wanted to be honest with myself and not just be like, hey, you know what? I'm okay, because anybody can, lie on those things. And so I finally passed the psych eval, and I come back, and now I get to tell my story. And I can tell you during that time I applied at other places that were not law enforcement, like the CDC, the VA, stuff like that. But I never got an email, I never got a call back. And then a few months after I became full duty, actually 2 months after I became full duty, I promoted to sergeant. And from there, I realized, hey, you know what? I am supposed to be here to help my fellow officers. And since then, I'm one of the peer support coordinators at our department. And now that's what I do. I'm patrol and peer support. So pretty much check on my guys, make sure that they're good. I try to bring them in after every death scene they go to, or something that may be critical to them. So that way I can help lessen the symptoms of PTS.
That's really difficult to talk about. I appreciated you sharing that with us, and I really thank you for that. Is that still hard to tell today?
I could tell you it's not as hard. I still have those emotions behind it, but they're not as strong. I went through EMDR therapy, eye movement desensitization reprocessing, and it helped me reprocess my thoughts about a lot of things that happened in my career. trying to make them more positive instead of the negative thoughts that I was having about them. So now I could tell you before therapy, I would shake, get nauseated when I would talk about it. And now I can just, talk about it and without overreacting to it. I still get, like anxious, but it's not as bad as it was before.
Why do you think cops are so afraid of seeking help?
I can tell you that cops are scared to seek help because they don't want to be seen as weak. We have a badge and a gun for a reason. We're there to help people, and at the same time, we never help ourselves. So we're scared of being unfit for duty. I can tell you through my process, I went through a fitness for duty. It scared me because I thought I was going to lose my job. That made it even worse. Like, hey, you know what? I'm already in this shithole, and now I'm getting a fitness for duty. Pretty much means I can't do my job, and it kicked me down. But there's also a lack of confidentiality and trust in law enforcement, where we feel like if we talk to a therapist, they're going to tell our department, or if somebody seeks help, a supervisor might ridicule them. And to this day, even with peer support out there and different avenues to get help, officers are still reluctant to get help because they're just scared of losing everything, losing their identity.
Do you think those are real fears? Do you think that there are places and people out there that aren't supporting the police whenever they're having problems, and that by sharing some of this stuff, it can hurt their career and job? Or is that a myth that isn't happening and officers need to set that aside and really go get that help?
So that's dependent on where you are. I have met with some officers that have told me about, some of the issues they've had with their department where they seek out help and then that help gets turned against them and then they get terminated. So I've seen that part of it, but then I've also seen the, like my part where, yes, I got the fitness for duty, but essentially it ended up helping me become better, stronger, and come back, to better to help not just myself, but to help my community better and to help my officers better. That way they don't have to go through all the things that I went through, or I can lessen the symptoms that I went through in them.
Well, it's clear that it has helped you become much better at helping those younger officers and those new officers kind of navigate this very difficult world and toxic world that law enforcement have to live in. But what interests me is you started very early on with some issues, not seeking help, even when like your FTO was trying to get you to do that. So you hadn't. Do you think you'd been indoctrinated already into the law enforcement, I'm not talking about my feelings thing? Or did you kind of bring that with you? Or is that a male trait? I'm curious.
So, I mean, being a police officer, you already when I came into policing, I already thought, hey, you know what, I have to be strong mentally, physically. I have to be able to arrest people. I have to be able to, detain somebody, stuff like that. And that mental aspect of it, we don't want to be seen as weak. I didn't want to be seen as weak. I didn't want to be that, that guy like, hey, you know what, this guy just started and he already, needs to debrief on a call and he's having these nightmares and he's going through this stuff. I felt that I just needed to keep it down and deal with it on my own instead of asking for help because I didn't want to be seen as weak or, not able to do the job or handle the job and what we see and do and deal with every day.
So do police process trauma differently than non-police? And how does that affect how we handle so much of the violent calls that we go on?
For cops, we do process trauma differently because instead of processing these emotions, we're actually trained to keep down the emotions and the feelings that we have at the time of the call. So we compartmentalize at the time of the call so that way we can do our job safely and effectively. But then, after the call is done, instead of bringing up those emotions and feelings and processing all that, we keep it down and we just go on to the next call, the next, death, the next accident. We might crack jokes after, a violent call or after, something tragic. And it's not because, we're trying to laugh at the situation. We're trying to cope with what we're seeing and what we're dealing with or what we just dealt with. A lot of people, I've gone to calls where people say, hey, you know what? You're nothing. You don't even do anything. Fuck the police, stuff like that. But they don't realize that I just came from, comforting a family because they lost a family member. And so the civilian side, they're able to seek the help without being ridiculed sometimes, depending on what profession you're in. They're able to, through time and support, they're able to get that help. And with us, we go from, like I said, from one traumatic call to the next without being able to process any of it.
I know that for me personally, talk about compartmentalizing, I definitely build these walls around certain events or certain calls. And, you kind of shut that door and throw that key away. But also, I know that later in life, now that I'm retired, there are times when something will open that door, something weird, something that you wouldn't think would connect to it. And that's when you get that really sometimes difficult emotional response. And I struggle sometimes to realize where it's coming from. But knowing that there is, trauma, and you can't go through a long career in this profession without having some of that and having to deal with that and knowing that's there. So that leads me into the question about if we know that there's a problem, we know we should worry about it. While some departments, I think, try to do this, most departments in the US don't prioritize mental health. How come?
I feel like departments are more focused on operational readiness, such as equipment, tactics, stats, trying to bring down, the crime stats, trying to, hey, you know what, we're the safest city in America. Yet, they don't realize that the officers that are making the city safe are dealing with all the crime and dealing with all this just to keep it down. Because mental health doesn't get fixed overnight. It's a long process. It can become expensive. So some departments might not have the budget, or they just might be like, hey, you know what? It it's better just to get rid of this officer than to pay for their therapy or to for them to get the help that they need. Lately, I have been seeing a shift, not in just my department, but in departments all over the US, where now they have psychological divisions just for their officers, wellness divisions. And it helps because now the officers are able to be more prepared physically and mentally to help the community. Like if we're not healthy mentally or physically, we can end up hurting either our partners or the community. And so I don't know if you ever heard the term hurt people hurt people. So if we're hurting, how can we help the person that's hurting? We're probably just going to either make it worse or, something like that. So, but I do see that there is a big shift going towards prioritizing officer wellness in a whole, not just mental health, but in a whole aspect.
So talk to me about emotional armor. I've seen you use that term before. Can you explain that to me? What does that mean?
So emotional armor is like psychological, mental armor or shield that we put on to survive the high stress situations that we deal with in law enforcement. Going back to the compartmentalization of trauma or scenes, that's where that emotional armor comes from. So that emotional armor, we put it on, and while we're taking in all this, information, traumatic information, tragic information, we store it behind, we let it get stuck on that emotional trauma, that emotional armor. It's like taking bullets on your bulletproof vest, right? So instead of taking the bullets, you're taking all this emotional trauma, this tragedies, tragic events, and it's hitting, making holes in that armor. If you forget to take off that armor too, you can go home and now you're emotionless at home. You're there, but you're not there. And another thing I like to say is like, it's like we have an on and off switch for our emotions, right? And we go to these calls, and as officers, we have to turn off our emotions while we're there. And then, we go to the next call and we forget to turn back on our emotions when we get home. So we become emotionally unavailable to our family, to our friends, and we start isolating. And that's where a lot of our problems start coming from. But we have to remember, just like our bulletproof vest, we need to take off that emotional armor when we get home. So that way we can still be vulnerable because we're still humans, be vulnerable with our family, let them know how we're feeling. Even with our partners, like, hey, this is what's going on. This is how I feel. This call made me feel this way. And so that's what that emotional armor is, pretty much a bulletproof vest for emotions and feelings that we should take off at the end of our shift, just like our bulletproof vest.
Yeah, I think that's a great analogy and can really help people keep in mind, keep focused on taking care of themselves when they need to. Now, in your story, you share about getting involved, drinking too much, having those issues and those problems. Obviously, alcohol, drug usage is not a healthy way to decompress, but unfortunately, we see officers turn towards that. What are some healthy ways to decompress from the stress of working and being a cop?
Some ways to decompress would be what I like to do are grounding techniques that I've learned through counseling. So there's the 5-4-3-2-1 method, there's breathing techniques, and these techniques, like the breathing and the 5-4-3-2-1, are things that you can do while you're at the scene or you're about to go to a scene. So that way you prepare yourself and you're able to regulate your nervous system. Outside of work, you can do that, or you can also do exercise, finding hobbies, or going to therapy itself to help you come back down to, hey, you know what, I'm in the here and now instead of being stuck in that traumatic incident or being stuck at work. So that way you can be there with your family and actually be present instead of being there and not being there mentally.
Now, I'm curious, when you started doing therapy, did you have a problem finding a therapist that could understand some of the things you had to talk about? Because, from the law enforcement standpoint, the things we have to deal with, regular people don't. And I know that some therapists might not necessarily be suited, or at least some officers may be afraid that the therapist they might get won't be capable or able to help them. How do you navigate that?
Yeah, so I have heard some stories where officers have used EAP and they're telling, the counselor on the other end of the phone or through telehealth, like, hey, this is what I went through, this is what's going on. And the therapist starts crying because they can't handle what the officer is telling them.
Right.
So what luckily for me, my sister-in-law, she's a licensed professional counselor and she knows a lot of mental health professionals. So she recommended me this trauma therapist. And so I did my intake and everything. And the first thing she tells me is, look, I don't know what you do. I don't know how you do it. I'm not going to tell you I know that I know what you do or how to do it, but I know trauma and I can fix trauma. So that helped me understand, like, hey, you know what? She's not telling me how to do my job or what I did wrong, but she's there to help me fix or overcome the traumatic things that I've gone through in my career. Because there are some, bad ways to go about it, and some officers may feel judged, and but luckily now there are a lot of cops or retired cops or current cops that are going to school for counseling, going to school for social work, so that way when officers that are active need help, they can go to these officers that are clinicians and they can empathize with them instead of sympathize. And they're able to understand, like, hey, I understand I went through a similar incident, or hey, I understand, I've gone through this, and it helps the officer overcome that barrier of, oh, they don't understand what I do. Like me, currently, I'm going to school, getting another bachelor's degree in social work, and hopes to get a master's in social work to be a clinical social worker. And I started going that route because my dad told me when he was going through therapy at the VA, he was like, these counselors don't know what I went through. They were never in Iraq. They never, so there was always that barrier of them not understanding, or the veteran feeling like they didn't understand what they went through. So luckily now, since all these officers are starting to realize, like, hey, you know what, I needed help. Now I can help others by getting this degree and being a clinician. That's starting to change, the whole getting the help and the barriers. So that way officers feel more comfortable in getting the help and talking to another officer that it is a clinician.
You talked about that emotional armor earlier and having to be able to let that down to be vulnerable to your families. I know that the families out there and that the partners are always there trying to help and support the officers. Why do we push away those that love us, and how can we learn to accept that support from our families?
The reason why we push them away is because we don't want them to hurt, or we don't want them to experience what we saw through our words, or what we've experienced through our words. We also feel like they wouldn't understand, going home and telling them, hey, you know what, I had to shoot somebody, or hey, I responded to a 6-month-old baby that died, while you have a 6-month-old at home, and you don't want to traumatize them. However, we know that if we don't talk to them, that it can affect our relationships with our families, our friends. And overcoming that, the way I do it is I describe myself as an onion. We pull back the layers of the onion slowly. So first, you need to ask your family members, do you want the Disney Channel version of my day? Do you want the news version of my day? Or do you want the blood, guts, and gore version of my day? And once you get that, you let them ask questions, like if they're peeling the onion. And once you start feeling uncomfortable to answer any questions, you stop and you let them know, like, hey, you know what, I'm not ready to talk about that part, or I'm not ready. So that way they know that there are boundaries. And sometimes we get home and we just don't want to say anything. We need time to decompress. And sometimes our spouses are at the door, like, hey, I need you to do this. I need you to do that. I need you to go here. I need you to go there. And we just dealt with 2 dead bodies and we got into a struggle at work. And they don't realize that while we're walking through the door, we're still thinking about that. And, now they're just putting more stuff on us. So creating those boundaries will help you. Like, hey, my fiance knows, like, give me 30 minutes when I get home, so that way I can decompress. And then after that, I'm good. But there are some days where I feel like my day was really emotional and I need a hug, so I'll hug her. And she can feel that. She'll know. And she understands now what I go through, what we both go through, and we all know that it affects the family as well. And right now, we're trying to focus a lot on the officer and forgetting the family. So I'm trying to incorporate both at our department, where we get to educate the family members on what to do if their loved one is feeling suicidal, or if they start noticing symptoms of PTSD, depression, anxiety. So that way they know what to do instead of being left in the dark and not knowing where to go.
I think that's fantastic advice. And I think those are great steps that people can follow to try to help starting to let their families help them. Now, one of the issues that you've not had to run into yet, but I know that there are a lot of us out there that it's that retirement age. And once you spend, 20, 30, 40 years in a career of law enforcement, and it's time to retire and you kind of stop all that, that can be really problematic. That emotional roller coaster comes to a screeching halt. Identity loss, being a police officer 24/7, and then all of a sudden not anymore, can also be really difficult. What are some things that retirees can do to either prepare for those mental issues that might be coming up during retirement, or deal with them if they pop up later?
So what I like to do and tell people is, before the badge, we were still Zach, or we were dad. Behind the badge, we're still Zach, dad, babe, husband, wife, grandpa, grandma, dad, mom. we're still all those things behind the badge. The badge is something that we do to provide food, shelter for our families and to keep our community safe. We have to remember that we're still human. We're still the people that we came into the world as. If we start recognizing that, hey, you know what, we're we're more than the badge before retirement. Once you get to retirement, it'll be easier for you to ease into the retirement. You know, start volunteering, teaching, coaching. We end up retirees end up losing like a sense of
Community is the one that comes to mind for me,
yeah,
or
yeah.
camaraderie. Yes.
So, and being able to teach and be around other people. So retirees, before you get there, make sure that you remember that, hey, you know what, I'm still somebody behind this badge. This badge isn't my identity, it isn't who I am, it's what I do. And if we start thinking that way at a young age, like, hey, the badge is just what I do and not who I am, then it should be an easier transition from being a cop to the civilian life. Now, if you're already past that, then trying to, still talk with other retirees. What I'm trying to do in my department is to get one of our peer support members who's about to retire to stay on our team, so that way he can be the liaison between the department peer support team and the retirees. So that way they can still feel a sense of identity of being a cop and that camaraderie. And one of our peer support members actually brought up doing like a retiree get together, barbecue, hot dogs, burgers, so that way, the officers that are in now can mingle with the retirees and they can still feel that sense of, hey, you know what, these people still love me. These people, still remember me. Because, it's happened to me where I'm talking about a lieutenant or I'm talking about a sergeant that's retired, and the new officer's like, who's that? It's
Right.
like, that's the reason why I'm a good supervisor, because of that supervisor. And, they forget who they are, or they had never met them before they retired. And, so being able to mingle that, it'll help also all that knowledge that these retirees have get passed on to the younger officers. And, it'll help both of them, because as we get older, we want to have that sense of purpose to spread our knowledge and be able to feel like, hey, you know what, I've done my life, I've gained all this experience, and now I want to give it back. So that's how I would say that retirees could learn, or if before you retire, learn how to get ready for retirement. Is remember that the badge is not our identity, it's what we do. And our identity is whatever, or whoever we are. Like in my case, Zachary, your case, Stephen, dad, grandpa. And so, yeah.
Yeah, I love that. I feel too often, too many police departments look at their retirees as, don't let the door hit you in the ass on the way out. And they don't do anything for them. There's no get-togethers. There's no touching base with that institutional history or knowledge. They just kind of say, you're gone, goodbye. I think that that's missing out on a lot. I think what you're thinking about is probably a great idea to help keep those retirees involved in that organization and help the younger officers with their experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then and just mingling with the retirees and the younger cops, it would be like peer support. Like, hey, you know what, an officer could have gone through something, and the retiree could have gone through something similar, and now they're talking about it,
Right.
and how the retiree overcame it, or maybe the younger officer overcame it, and the retiree is still dealing with it. Now the younger officer can help the retiree, like, hey, this is what I do to cope, or this is how I got over it. So it's helping both the retirees and the active officers.
Now, the last thing I want to ask you about is the thing I don't want to ask you about, and that's the suicide rates in law enforcement. Unfortunately, a month ago, I lost a friend of mine who killed himself on the job, and it is so difficult. And it's a problem that we have. How do we bring those suicide rates down in law enforcement?
So there have been, especially this year, there's already been, I want to say around almost 30 suicides, active and retired. In order for us to bring down those suicide rates is that we need to normalize talking about mental health and, coming forward with what we're going through instead of keeping it to ourselves. I use my story, my mental health journey to, not for sympathy, but for other officers to realize like, hey, you might be going through something, but another person has gone through it, another officer has gone through it, and they've overcome it. Let me go talk to this officer so that way I can figure out how they did it so that way I can do it too. Starting in the academies, doing a whole week of just wellness, mental wellness, physical wellness, so that way in the academies they tell you, hey, as a cop, you have a high rate of suicide, you have a high rate of divorce, you have a high rate of drug abuse, alcoholism, but they never tell you the why, and they never tell you how to not get there. So if we start that in the academies, like, hey, these are the ways, healthy ways to cope with traumatic incidents. These are healthy ways to get around the problems that we're going through. And if we teach them, then they're able to get through it through their career. And they wouldn't be so hard on seeking, it wouldn't be so hard for them to seek help. So what we're doing at our department now is that every new group of officers we get, we do a peer support presentation. So that way, hey, you know what? These are all the peer support members. This is what you can experience. If you start feeling these symptoms, you can always contact the peer support member. If you don't want to contact the peer support member, these are the mental health professionals that we have, free of charge. We have our chaplains. So starting them young to realize that they need help or when they need help, to get the help. Talking about mental health and briefing roll calls. Like doing mental wellness check-ins with your officers, like, hey, are you good? Hey, or even getting in the unit with each one of your officers and just talking to them about how they're doing. So that way they feel like they are cared for. This newer generation of officers, they want that, hey, you're doing good. Hey, you know what? I'm there for you if you need anything. We need to remind officers that they aren't alone and that it's okay not to be okay sometimes, and that the badge doesn't make us invincible, but it makes us human. We're human just like everybody else, all the people that we talk to, all the people that we help. We bleed red blood just like they do. And if we remember that we're human, we'll remember to process these feelings, these emotions, and we wouldn't get to that point of having to suffer in silence by ourselves to where now we're killing ourselves. So I think just the education on mental health and wellness throughout our careers, doing check-ins and stuff like that will help us overcome that, to bring down those suicide rates, because one suicide is too many. We need it at 0.
Zach, this has been fantastic. If any of my listeners want to reach out to you, to talk to you, to find out more about what you're doing, how can they get a hold of you?
They can get a hold of me on LinkedIn under my name, Zachary Saenz. And then I have my email, which is morethanthebadge21@gmail.com. And that's where I get all my emails for, peer requests outside of my department, peer requests just to talk. And I'm here 24/7. If anybody needs help or anybody, just wants to talk about anything, it can be personal or work related, and I'm always here.
Zach, thanks again for coming on and talking with me. I really appreciate it.
Yes, sir. No problem, Steve. Thank you for having me.
And that's the story we have to tell. Thank you for joining. As always, I'm curious what questions you're getting asked. What isn't the news covering? What story needs to be told? Connect with me at bluecanarypodcast@gmail.com.